Well, thanks everyone for being here, and I hope you had a lovely breaking convention of this year's edition. It feels quite wholesome to be closing the sessions of talks right at this time. And what I'm going to be talking about today is what are the effects of drug use, specifically what are the effects of psychedelics, with a great focus on that, on the brain and behavior, before, during, and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Although it is the case that while I was doing my slides this morning, I actually came up with a better title for my talk. And it's going to become very evident as I go through everything that I've prepared for today, why that is. First of all, before I begin talking about any of the results today, I would like to take a moment to just introduce myself to those of you who might not be so familiar with my work so far. And I've been made aware that people cannot really recognize me by this model of my own brain, which used to be headlining all of my social media and public appearances up until a week ago. So I'm just going to start telling you a bit about what my actual work is. I'm a computational neuroscientist at Imperial College in London. And some people in the psychedelic sphere specifically might be more familiar with my work to do with how we can use psychedelics or derivatives of ketamine in order to pharmacologically alter maladaptive memories. Some other people might be familiar with another branch of my work, as Pascal has mentioned, which is one of the TV series based on our studies of human intelligence at Imperial that has been produced in collaboration with the BBC a number of years ago. Or maybe even from all of the touring I've been doing around the UK at the invitation of Seed Talks. But most recently, what I've been working on is the Great British Intelligence Test, which actually makes the topic of most of today's results. And my main research interest at the moment really is what is it that drugs are doing to the brain? What is it that doing drugs does outside of controlled settings? So when an individual is just keen on using a variety of substances for whichever reason under the sun of their choosing, what are the specific effects that we would see on their mental health or on their cognitive ability? And what can we make out of that? So what I've been doing for the past 3 years is to build up on this study arm of the Great British Intelligence Test in order to answer these very, very key questions. So just as an introduction, the Great British Intelligence Test is actually one of the largest cognitive testing initiatives in the world, where we have tested cognitive abilities in over 500,000 individuals. And this is what allowed us to be able to answer this at large scale. And I'm going to give you a bit overview of the whole study and what has happened there of the recruitment process. And I'm going to touch on a couple of findings in relation with mental health and cognitive abilities, but also discuss them and what can we make out of them and how can we take this knowledge forwards and employ it in future scientific practice and so forth. So just to begin with, the Great British Intelligence Test aimed to test the cognitive abilities of as many British individuals as possible. So we were very lucky to be partnering up with the BBC, who kindly advertised our cognitive testing platform on their main website for a number of months. And this advertisement started just before 2020, so around Christmas time in December 2019. And between that point and the release of a Horizon documentary that was based on our work in May 2020, around 500,000 individuals signed up and completed this cognitive testing. You can see the amount of people that have completed over time here. And you can see that the peaks related specifically to this like extra documentaries that we put forward and so forth. One of the key aspects of this work, we weren't planning on overlapping with a global pandemic, but as all of you know, in March 2020, the world changed shape, essentially. So what we decided to do afterwards is to try to monitor people to see what were the impact of these changes caused by the pandemic on a number of different factors. It was very, very nice that around 1 in 5 individuals who completed this initial testing gave us their email addresses and agreed to be part of future research studies. So we started surveying those individuals every 6 months, and quite a large number of those responded. This is around the time when I started adding the drug use arm to the study. And that included an assessment of their drug use during the pandemic, just before the pandemic as well, retrospectively that was, and also a very, very diverse mental health assessment in order to see whether their drug use has any relationship with that as well. And there are quite a lot of number of sub-studies that have emerged during the Great British Intelligence Test, some of which I'm going to be presenting further. But I think one of the main questions that is worth asking at this stage is, out of this massive amount of individuals who decided to be part of our initiative, how many of them are drug users to begin with? It's quite interesting to see that around 1 in 3 people in the UK declared having used a recreational drug, and that is not to mean alcohol or tobacco, in their lifetime. So that gave us great scope to continue assessing drug use and see, well, it seems that quite a lot of the population might be fitting into this category. In particular, around 1 in 10 individuals declared having used a recreational drug before, which again is kind of illustrative of the fact that psychedelics are becoming quite prevalent in the population and people do report them. And again, this brings back to one of my favorite quotes that I always come back to, which relates to how the human experience is quite intertwined with drug use. And this is from Dr. Ronald Siegel, who was saying that the human urge to intoxicate is so strong that it is the 4th most primal instinct after hunger, thirst, and sex. And I think this is quite well represented in the data that we've collected, because it is indeed that a majority of these individuals do engage in drug use for a variety of reasons. Now, one of the things that I've been trying to do with all of these massive amounts of data is to try to understand what are the different associations between drugs that people are using. Because when people are using drugs in the wild, we cannot necessarily expect them to only stick with one substance, or maybe we can. That was unknown. So I've approached this from a data-driven perspective and came up with different clusters based on the patterns of associations that were present in the data to describe what are the different choices that these different individuals would make. And there are these 6 different clusters that illustrate the drug use choices from before the pandemic and during the pandemic, so within 3 years of the assessments that we've done. And it seems that, for example, some people might gravitate towards cannabis, some towards cocaine, but also people would gravitate towards other drugs, such as psychedelics or MDMA, but they would pair them with cannabis as well. And I think it's very important to keep note of the fact that if we're trying to model drug use outside of controlled laboratory settings, it's important to account for all of these different associations. These associations changed during the pandemic, and the clusters became a lot more diverse. The participants actually described in their own words why some of these reasons might be, such as the fact that some drugs were not available anymore, whereas others were just not interesting, or they didn't have the social context that they were used to use those drugs into. But most importantly, if we want, a lot of the initial hypotheses around how drug use was going to change during the pandemic concerned a great degree of concern towards whether drug use is going to increase. So a lot of the original hypotheses posed around March 2020 and so forth said that because of a loss of employment, because of the high disruptions in people's lives, we will see an upswing in recreational drug use. So it's quite interesting when our study did not actually see that upswing. In fact, we saw that the majority of people did stop using drugs during the pandemic, and a lot of them started using a lot less. There was a notable minority who did increase their use. And in general, we can show that the use of drugs during the pandemic had a very, very strong relationship with the levels that people were using them right before. And this is also very dependent on the intensity at which they were using drugs previously. So we see that those who were not necessarily frequent users stopped using drugs, whereas those who were daily users haven't had much change. And those who were in the middle, so monthly users, went both directions. And that is like a much more interesting group. But one of the key questions that we've been trying to address with this study is, who is it, part of this cohort, that had better mental health and better mood? And based on the overwhelming evidence that we saw in the recent publications around psychedelics, we hypothesized that, well, it means that people who took a psychedelic during the acute stages of COVID-19 had probably had better moods and higher resilience than those who never used drugs or those who used different other substances. So that's why it was extremely surprising when that was not what we saw at all. In fact, what we saw is that those who were psychedelics users had quite a lot of different mental health problems, specifically apathy, anxiety, depression, and so forth. And that was actually the case for the majority of the drug use clusters that we've identified, with one exception, which is that of MDMA users. And it's quite interesting. Again, I'm going to touch on this again in the discussion of the findings, but they do sort of go against the grain of what has been shown before. As I mentioned, there are different associations and patterns that we identify with drug users that are specific to their choices they're making. And it turns out that people who use psychedelics mostly use cannabis as well. So then we run this subtractive analysis to see whether people who use psychedelics and cannabis, for example, had better mood than those who only use cannabis in order to sort of isolate the effects of psychedelics. And unfortunately, that was also not the case. And we kept seeing these negative associations with mood and resilience. One of the other arms of the study was trying to look at whether we see any cognitive fingerprints of using psychedelics and other drugs, whether people perform better or worse on memory tasks, attention, whether they have different problem-solving abilities or language abilities. And we know from previous literature, and I've detailed this quite a lot in one of my papers, that in the acute state, when someone is under the influence of a psychedelic, cognition changes quite drastically. But it is not known at the moment to what extent some of these changes persist long after the trip is over. And this is where the Cognitron came in very handy, which is the platform for cognitive testing that we've been using, which has all of this variety of different computerized cognitive tests that allow us to understand how cognitive abilities function in humans. And what we found here was also quite interesting. And one of the things we can see already is that there is a certain bar that points downwards, and that is representative of the cocaine users, who seem to have lower cognitive performance relative to those who never used drugs in their lifetime across all of the different cognitive domains we've studied. But what was really interesting to see is that if we look at this particular task over here, so that's a word definitions task, and normally what happens there is that the older someone gets, their vocabulary expands, and they're able to come up with these definitions for really obscure old words that are not necessarily something that a 20-year-old would be familiar with. We noticed that on this task, those who are psychedelics users actually seem to perform quite a bit better relative to those who never used drugs in their lifetime. And it is a very puzzling question because we're trying to address this in more detail and understand why we might see these effects. Now, importantly, when we're trying to address questions about recreational drugs in general, there's quite a lot of information out there and a lot of variables that need to be accounted for. So I call this seeing in the dark, is trying to identify what are really the constructs we're dealing with when the whole landscape is quite chaotic. And the present study that I'm describing has quite a lot of different strengths that really allow us to draw the conclusions with confidence, such as having a very large sample size that's inclusive of a control population who performed the same test but never used drugs in their lifetime, such as being able to collect detailed drug use history not limited to psychedelics use and model these associations with higher precision. And also talking about participant recruitment, none of the participants part of our study knew that they were going to be asked questions about their recreational drug use, which basically means that we are not biased towards people who might just have been eager to take part in a study because of an interest in psychedelics. And that's quite important. So with all of this in mind, why is it that we are seeing what we are seeing, and what can we make of it? Well, first of all, it is definitely the case that drug use has changed significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd argue that this is very important to keep in mind from this point onwards, because due to the large-scale disruption in people's lives, and specifically in their drug use, that would mean that from this point onwards, those disruptions will manifest themselves in one way or another in people's mental health, in people's cognitive ability, and so forth. So we do need to account for that. And in general, people do not choose to only use one drug, unless that is cannabis or cocaine. But drugs such as psychedelics, MDMA, and others are normally used in combination. And it's important to account for all of these different patterns when we try to make inferences about what we're studying. And perhaps the most challenging aspect of this study is trying to explain the relationship between the associations we see between drug use and mental health. And that is because there is no clear answer between this problem that I call the chicken, the egg, and the cycle, which basically says that it's not possible to understand fully just yet whether it is that people with poor mood and mental health start to take drugs to begin with, or is it something in the drugs that causes the mood problems, and what is the cycle repetitive relationship between these two. In particular, if we are to think about why we see this negative association between the use of psychedelics and mood in our sample, there could be a variety of different reasons. I like to come back to this importance of context and setting when we talk about psychedelic experiences. And one of the hypotheses could be that the psychedelics being regarded as non-specific amplifiers might have amplified the context of general distress. Now, there's a variety of other explanations, such as the fact that in order to see a positive effect on mood as resulting from a psychedelic experience, the therapeutic context might be necessary, or it might also be the case that those effects are short-lived, and there was quite a gap between when the experience happened and when we surveyed the participants. It's also possible that taking drugs in association, such as the association with cannabis that is the strongest we identify in the sample, could be driving some of these results as well. Or, and perhaps this might come controversially, is it could be that in order to see an improvement, we really just need to look at the within subjects design, which is measuring a mood in the same person before and after the psychedelic experience. But then there comes a question whether by having psychedelic experiences, it is possible or not to bring the mood and the mental health levels of an individual to the level of those who never use drugs in their lifetime. With cognition, we definitely note that there are cognitive fingerprints of recreational drug use. And I think this is quite important because cognition is essentially the summary of the abilities that allow people to perform day-to-day tasks. And it's quite important to note what can be modulated with psychedelics or with other drugs to begin with. And again, here it's impossible to tell with precision what are the causal relationships between drug use and cognition without running prospective studies specifically aiming to measure this. So in this case, for example, with the positive association and the overperformance of people who take psychedelics on the word definitions task, could it be that the majority of psychedelics users who we surveyed are simply poets? Or could it be that psychedelics are in turn making them read more and try to seek to different knowledge in places where they would enlarge their vocabulary and so forth? We're currently running extra analysis to try to understand these links better. So what can we make out of all of this and going forwards? I think with every single study that I've run in my past 10 years of being a researcher, it normally leads to more questions than answers. And specifically, I think there are two main factors that should be accounted for from this point onwards when we try to model the effects of recreational drug use or of psychedelics specifically in the general population. And first of all, I think that rigorous scientific practices are actually key here, and trying to do our best as scientists to ensure that what we're mapping is specifically related to reality. And I do like to say that science is not a checkbox that needs to be ticked just to prove what's already in our hearts, but it's an instrument that we should be using to prove our hearts wrong. If it stays, then we're right. We always knew it intuitively. But if it doesn't, that's very important, and it should be discussed and put forward. And aside from rigorous scientific practices, I think there's a general high role for the general public that they should be playing in this. And that is first and foremost to use empirical evidence to draw conclusions. You've seen the presentations of some of my colleagues regarding the sensationalist headlines in the media or the skewed perspective and the misinterpretation of our findings that's very often present. So it's good to try to go straight to the source and maybe email the researcher if the paper is not available open access. And with that, I would say it's also important to always keep in mind that science is not perfect. Science can be improved, and to try to address those findings with a critical eye and see maybe something could be done differently and would lead to another result. But most importantly, harm reduction should be at the forefront of the psychedelic renaissance. And for people who do want to use drugs, there's a variety of different information sources on the internet. It's abundant of different harm reduction practices and how to go about staying safe during a psychedelic experience. And most important out of those, to leave the mixing to the DJ and to keep reading, keep researching, and mainly because knowledge is power. So thank you.